Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Thrive in China Roundtable. Welcome for those of you that are new, for those of you that are coming regularly every Wednesday. The whole purpose of the Thrive in China Roundtable is to give you insight into corporate administrative measures that hopefully can help you make decisions when creating your foundation in China or understanding how to operate and maintain your organization in China. Now, whenever we have these roundtables, I always love to know who is in my audience. So if you haven't done so yet, please let me know who you are. Are you a newbie to China? Are you a startup in China? Are you an experienced China hand? This always gives me a little bit of insight as to who is within my audience. And we love to take this poll to also then steer the conversations a bit better for those that are joining. So let us know who you are. For those who don't know me, my name is Christina Kohler-Colucci. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. I'm one of the leading experts on inbound investment to China. I have over 18 years of experience in the corporate services, corporate administration, corporate compliance realm specific to China. Our head office is based in Hong Kong, where we also help to administer and maintain and run corporate entities there. And then we have our subsidiary in Shanghai. We have worked with over 600 international companies across a variety of different industries and sectors in terms of their strategy into Hong Kong and China, their implementation in the region, as well as then how to grow and how to scale their organization and ultimately how to operate it efficiently. I am a creator of the following administrative processes that you see here. It's been quite a journey over the last 20 years, and to discover that China is becoming more transparent has helped tremendously. So we've created a variety of different webinars offering companies the blueprint, if you will, of doing a action list of what they have to do in terms of creating a sound foundation, of what they should be prioritizing when going into the Chinese market. And it's the whole journey from start to growing and scaling, ultimately. I don't want to say to finish because it's a never-ending, hopefully a never-ending journey in China. If you have not received a copy of our ebook called The 10 Biggest Mistakes Companies Make in China, then please email me at christina@woodburnglobal.com. We are offering this free copy to everybody that is joining our Thrive in China Roundtable. Now, to start off today's roundtable, today we're going to be investigating the roles, the responsibilities, and allocating powers amongst senior management in China. All right. There seems to be a lot of issues around this topic. It can be quite an obstacle for many companies going into China to find people who are willing to take on these roles. And what I've discovered throughout my journey is that it's not so much about finding people to appoint, it's actually explaining to those people what are the roles that have to be appointed for, what are the responsibilities that you have to take on when you're taking on those roles, and ultimately, what are the liabilities for that individual. Now, on top of all of that, it's how do you minimize risk or mitigate risk? How do you allocate certain powers? And how can you also protect the business? So we're going to go through all of these aspects today in today's presentation. All right, so to start off with, to give you a bit of background for those that are new and don't really know all the terms in terms of the roles, what roles are in the corporate management in a China company? So the roles that have to be appointed for. So first of all, this is your homework, basically. The action plan is who should actually be appointed for these roles, understanding what the responsibilities of these roles are, what are the liabilities, and then how can you protect the business. Today, I'm not going to be talking about shareholder because ultimately the shareholder can be an individual, it can be a corporate structure. You need to do a global analysis to understand what is the best fit for you in terms of who your shareholder should be. Should it be a corporate structure? Should it be an individual? I have just recently had an inquiry from a US client that has been pushed by a supplier to localize their business in a variety of different jurisdictions. Now, China has hit its turn. And my question was, have you thought about who the shareholder is going to be, considering you have so many options available to you? And it's only now that they're doing a global project to see how to minimize their liabilities, what are their tax optimization possibilities, etc. So I'm not touching on shareholder because this really needs to be tailor-made to you in order to analyze this. But let's just say a shareholder can be an individual, it can be an entity. Overseas individual, overseas entity. Then you have to figure out who's going to be the authorized signatory of the shareholder. Again, I'm not going to touch on this. There's so many different varieties. You might have a small organization with one director or multiple directors. You've got to figure out how you want to go about appointing power of authority in your own shareholding structure in terms of who signs off on all the documents associated with China. All right. Now, the meaty part of this subject is what I'm going to be talking about today, which is, are you going to have a board of directors or are you going to have an executive director? Who's going to be the legal rep? Who's going to be the GM? Who's going to be a supervisor? And who are you going to appoint as a finance manager, tax agent? One thing that I did not go into details about finance manager, tax agent, because I think that's quite clear to understand. You are either outsourcing this role or you are hiring a CFO, finance director, finance manager to then be appointed in this. What I want everybody to understand, though, is that these roles need to be appointed prior to the incorporation of a company in China. So all of this decision-making has to be done prior to the incorporation, okay? I haven't gone into the finance manager, tax agent, because again, that's a financial role. It's something that could be outsourced. All I will highlight on that point is that you do need to submit with the name of that contact a Chinese mobile number. All the others can be foreign mobile numbers. With that one, you do need a Chinese mobile number. So you are ultimately pushed to appoint somebody locally. And again, which is why I say in 99.9% of all cases, the initial person that is in that role is an outsourced person. Individual, cannot be a company, needs to be an individual. At Woodburn, for example, we appoint our staff to go into these roles because they are then the contact people or they are the contact person by the tax bureau, okay? So the meaty stuff of what we're talking today is really about board of directors, legal rep, general manager, supervisor, and any other senior management roles that may be appointed, but do not have to be allocated within the corporate management structure when you're setting up the entity. All right. Now, my big question that I have to everybody is, who has a fear to, as an individual, not related to the company, who has a fear to hold any one of these positions related to the China business? Now, in many situations, when I have these conversations and people ask me for recommendations, I always say to them, look, whether you're setting up in China, whether you're setting up in India, Brazil, Germany, France, the United States, you have to appoint somebody as a director. For some reason, people tend to have more fear when it is associated with China. I feel it's the opposite. I have more fear if it be another country, just because of the unknowns. I don't know how it works there, right? I know how it works in China. For me, there's no fear. I can hold many roles. I know how to protect myself. I've done it for 20 years. Obviously, somebody who's brand new to the market and what they read about China, all the risks and dilemmas that occur, I completely sympathize and empathize with you if you do have a level of fear. It's because you don't know what it's like to run a business there. You may not know what ways you can protect yourself or what ways you can minimize your liability and your risk, right? Ultimately, though, we want to appoint the right people for the right roles. What we want to avoid is turnover of these roles that have been, the people that have been appointed within these roles, okay? We have had a client a long, long time ago, a Canadian client who had appointed individuals for their incorporation. And in fact, within the first 12 months of operating in China, they changed the corporate management structure 3 times. Not only did that just cause a disruption in terms of the startup phase of the entity, but it costs them a tremendous amount in corporate service fees to make those changes, right? We want to avoid all of that. We just want to be able to appoint the right people from the beginning. Now, in order to give you a clear understanding of the organogram, all right? So like I said, you've got a shareholder who is appointing different roles within the Chinese structure. This shareholder is an overseas entity, overseas individual. You have an authorized signer or multiple authorized signers associated with that shareholder. That shareholder is going to appoint a board of directors, which is a minimum of 3 people, a legal representative. Generally speaking, chairman of the board will be the legal rep. It doesn't always have to be the case. And then a general manager. Separate from that, so somebody who's not in that current structure has to be allocated as a supervisor, also appointed by the shareholder, okay? So that's one option. The other option, so ultimately, when you're looking at this structure, you need at least a minimum of 4 people. 3 people in the board. Chairman of the board will be the legal rep, will also be the GM, and then you need a 4th person to act as the supervisor. That's the smallest type of structure you can have with the board of directors. The other alternative is, instead of a board of directors, you have an executive director, 1 person. So the shareholder appoints an executive director, appoints also a legal rep, a GM, and then separate from that, a supervisor. In that option, you only need a minimum of 2 people, because the executive director could be the legal rep, who could also be the general manager, and then you have a 2nd person who's the supervisor. Now, of course, you can have 1 person executive director, 1 person legal rep, 1 person GM. Totally up to you, okay? You have to go through these internal discussions to understand what is the best structure for you and who is actually decision makers within this China structure. Okay, who are going to be decision makers? Is there 1 person? Are there multiple people? And how do they get involved operationally? Who's making what decisions? All right. So again, there is no right or wrong in terms of choosing these people. These are just the roles. You have to have these roles appointed before you can start your incorporation in China. Okay. I will be coming back to this slide so that people can visualize the structure. But I want people to understand the criteria very briefly about these roles. All right. So first of all, you do not need to reside in China to hold any of these roles. Okay. You can have a foreign mobile, you have a foreign passport. You do not need to be residing in China. You can, not a requirement. You want to appoint people that are responsible for the China business. Okay, do not involve random folks within your organization to be involved. You want people who are knowing what's going on in the China business, are aware of the China strategy, and are decision makers in relation to the China strategy. Okay, so again, understand who's in that picture and what their roles are actually supposed to be. What decisions are they individually making? The board of directors, if you choose the route of board of directors, the chairman of the board will by default be the legal representative. However, I just want to highlight, it does not have to be that case. The legal representative can also be the in-house counsel. It's very rare that you will find an external party hold that role. But could be. You just, it's just appointing a legal representative. It's very rare that somebody would do that because of the liability associated with that type of role, and I will explain the responsibilities later on. Now, the member of the board can be the legal representative, who can also be the general manager. In this solution with the executive director on the right-hand side, again, the executive director can be the legal rep, can also be the GM. However, the supervisor cannot be a board member, cannot be the executive director, cannot be the legal rep, cannot be the GM. The supervisor needs to be somebody completely different than those that are in the main part of the business. okay? And throughout today's presentation, I will give you some insight on who I would generally involve in these appointments, okay? I'm giving my opinion, does not have to be used. It's just a recommendation that I see the trend that I see many companies doing, all right? All right, so I want people to understand the responsibilities of each of these roles, okay? Now, a lot of this information, these bullet points that I have put in, are actually generated and coming out of the articles of association that are drafted in relation to the China company. In the articles of association, there is a chapter on the responsibilities of the board of directors or the responsibilities of the executive director. Okay, and a lot of these points, these bullet points that I've put in, are directly coming from that articles of association. In the articles of association, which are your company bylaws, it dictates what the roles and responsibilities are of those individuals. Okay, so the responsibilities of the board or the executive director is convening the shareholders meeting and reporting to the shareholders. We can see that very clearly from this diagram. The board and the executive director are reporting to the shareholder, okay? They are also executing on the shareholders' resolutions. They're working out the corporate strategy. They're working out the investment plan. Also related to the fact that they're working on the company's financial budget plan and accounting plans. They're working on profit repatriation strategies, profit distribution plans, profit loss plans, etc. They're working out whether the company in China needs to increase its registered capital. In the articles of association, it will also state decrease, although this is a very hard application to do. They're going to also investigate whether the corporate bonds should be issued or not. They will work out whether there are any merger and acquisition plans, whether there will be added investors, whether the company will go into liquidation. So they are looking at the overall strategy of the company on a macro level, okay? They're also going to make decisions on the establishment of the company's senior managers within the organization, okay? Now, in this diagram, I have actually indicated that the shareholder is appointing the board of directors legal rep GM. If the shareholder has appointed the board of directors, in reality, the chairman of the board is also then the legal rep, is also then the GM. It's done by the shareholder. If you choose ultimately different people, then it really is the board of directors or the executive director appointing and dismissing the general manager. Okay, that's one thing. I also want to highlight at this point that if I go back here to this diagram, these general managers appointed here are actually appointed within the Ministry of Commerce's database system. In reality, the actual general manager that you hire does not have to be that general manager that is appointed within the Ministry of Commerce. So let me just repeat that again. The general manager that you actually hire does not have to be appointed as this general manager that is within the corporate management structure. That's a senior manager. These are corporate management individuals. Okay? Now you might be saying, Sheena, that's a weird thing to be doing. Why wouldn't they be the same person? You're right. The issue is that in the corporate management, these are individuals that are appointed for the incorporation of the company and within the Ministry of Commerce. If you have high turnover, you are going to have to make these changes constantly. Choose individuals that are stable. If you are hiring a general manager that you've just hired, you barely know the individual. You don't know if they're going to pass probation. You don't know a lot of things yet about them because trust hasn't been built yet, nor loyalty. You also don't know if they're going to leave you. Why put them into this management structure when you've still got doubts or unknowns? Keep them separate. That way you're also mitigating risk and simplifying the whole government aspect versus the actual operational day-to-day aspect. Okay. So that's that one thing I want to highlight. So if you're hiring a senior manager who is not in the corporate management, but is designated as the GM or a senior manager role, they will usually be appointed by the board and the executive director. Okay. The board is also going to work out basic rules and policies of the company, i.e. the employee handbook. And in theory, they should be fully informed about everything that is written in the articles of association and company bylaws. Okay. Legal representative. The responsibility of the legal rep is that they have the legal authority as the legal rep to interact with Chinese officials, i.e. they are the legal face to the Chinese authorities. They are there to execute the powers and duties of the company, to be held accountable for them. They are safeguarding the company's assets. They do have power of attorney on behalf of the company to sign off on changes within the structure. They sign contracts and agreements. They file reports and are the legal representation of the Chinese company to the Chinese regulatory authorities, like for example, the Finance Bureau, the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, the Tax Bureau, the bank. They are the authorized signatory immediately at the bank, etc. Okay. So now I haven't touched on the liabilities of the board of directors, because ultimately, as long as the board of directors are, or the executive director are just looking from a macro level on the strategy of China, they're not really going to be involved in the day-to-day execution of that strategy. The legal representative, because by default, they are signing, filing things in their name, they have a higher liability than those in the board of directors or executive director. And the legal representative may be sentenced with administrative sanctions or penalties. And obviously, if they do something that constitutes a crime, there will be a criminal investigation associated with it. I just want to highlight to everybody today watching this that this is the same whether you set up a company in the US, whether you set it up in Germany, whether you set it up in France. Okay, it might not be termed as legal representative, but the director of those companies could be criminally sanctioned if they perform criminal activities. Okay, just like anywhere else in the world. Now, obviously, what is considered a criminal activity is if they are conducting illegal operations beyond the range approved, if they're concealing facts from the regulatory authorities, and whether they're practicing fraud. Obviously, all of this is knowingly, right? If it's unknowingly, there's a lot more proof that has to happen, because then you have to allocate that blame to the finance manager or to whomever else, okay? If they are secretly withdrawing funds or hiding property, withdrawing funds, easy to do because they are immediately the bank signatories, okay? If they're disposing of property without authorization after the company's been declared bankrupt, dissolved, disbanded, if they fail to apply for registrations or don't make public announcements promptly as well, or if they do any other activities that would be considered as criminal activity, i.e. kickbacks. If they're knowingly accepting kickbacks, if they are knowingly accepting bribes, all of this type of stuff, obviously, these are criminal activities, okay? Again, this sounds very heavy. This is what is instilling fear in people when I go on these slides about the liabilities, but I just want to highlight this is like every other country. So what can you do to protect yourself? And that's what we're going to touch on. Now, in terms of the responsibilities of the general manager, their responsibility is really on a day-to-day basis. They're going to be supervising the business operations of the company. either remotely or on the ground. They're implementing the resolutions that have been signed off on by the board or the executive director. They're executing the China strategy. They're executing the operational plans. They're executing the investment funds. They're basically executing the day-to-day operation of the business. Okay. They may also propose, appoint, dismiss finance managers or any other senior personnel. And then it's a matter at this point with the general managers who are doing the day-to-day executions, whether they have other limitations, whether they have other powers of authority, whether they have other responsibilities. Okay, this is just an overview to give people an understanding. Supervisor's responsibility is really to, I'm going to go back to the diagram. I think it's easier if I go on the diagram to explain. Let me just go back to this. The supervisor has been appointed by the shareholder, and their role is to supervise and make sure that the strategy plans done by the board or the executive director, the documents that have been signed by the legal rep, and the day-to-day execution of the general manager is according to PRC compliance. Okay? And they are reporting to the shareholder should there be non-compliance. And it's really from a corporate administration perspective. So this is why the first item under the responsibility of the supervisor is inspecting the financial affairs of the company. Are the books, the taxes, payroll, all done according to PRC compliance? And like I said, they're also supervising the performance and duties of the directors. They're required to inform the shareholder should any action have been taken by those corporate managers that could damage the interests of the company. Okay. They are proposing the convention of interim shareholder meetings should misbehavior occur. If you will, they are the outsider spying on the activities of the other individuals, making sure that things are going as they should in the Chinese market. And if they're not going correctly, why are they not going correctly? And then reporting to the shareholder on that. Okay. They could have more responsibilities. It's just a matter of them placing that in the articles of association and indicating what those would be. Now, I want to highlight supervisors can be outsourced. There are a lot of corporate service providers like us who offer this solution of supervisor. And in the majority of cases, it will be a requirement that then the company of that supervisor does the financial affairs of the company to make sure that they can detect whether there is any non-compliance occurring within the organization. That's usually the first step of discovering if non-compliance is happening. Now, we are going to touch on allocating power of authority within the Chinese organization. And I love this phrase. Delegating power, it always requires a certain degree of trust, but there are a few simple measures that every foreign investor should consider to mitigate the risks its company in China is exposed to. And I want to highlight this as a starting point when you're starting off in China, okay? It is my belief that trust is earned. I also believe that loyalty is earned. You don't earn it overnight. In that period, that startup period where you're trying to earn the trust of your team, your senior managers, your corporate managers related to your Chinese investment, you can implement certain operational guidelines that mitigate the risk of the company. But as a disclaimer, I do want to highlight that when you implement these measures, it will cause inefficiency within your organization. So there is a balancing act that needs to occur between mitigating your risks and making sure that you don't lose out on the speed of scaling and growing because of certain inefficiencies regarding the administration of the company. We have a situation right now with a client of ours where the Chinese staff are so angry with us because we have been appointed to mitigate risks within the organization, and it is causing disruption and inefficiencies. And I say this not because it's Woodburn's decision to do this, it's because it's been a directive by the shareholder to say, we, the shareholder, are not yet fully feeling secure within the Chinese market, and we want these measures to remain until we do feel better. So I highlight all of this just to say that the corporate service providers that you might take on, whether it's law firms, whomever, to help you to keep these measures in place, they might get a lot of backlash from the local staff because they are causing inefficiencies within the organization. And I'll explain a couple of those here, okay? I think in any startup, like in any relationship, you've got to set up limitations and boundaries. And you also have to know when it is right to become more flexible and ease those limitations and ease those boundaries. Like I said, trust is earned over time, but at some point that trust is there, you've got to accept it, and then you've got to give a little bit, right? So when you're starting up in China, these are a couple that have come up in my head of examples where you can mitigate your risk, create boundaries so that you can earn people's trust. One is setting limitations within the Articles of Association for the appointed officers. Okay? How much power of authority are you going to give them? Do they have full reign? Or are you going to set limitations on certain decisions that have to then go to the shareholder and be signed off by the shareholder? Are you going to have banking transfer limitations by them, etc.? What limitations are you going to set, if any? The next is when the company is actually established and you've got a company kit, which has licenses and shops. Who maintains those? And who has access to them? And what is the approval process for the use of them? So most startups will use an intermediary, like a law firm, corporate services firm, to keep these licenses and shops. And everything that has to be signed, chopped, will go through the intermediary, who maintains a logbook to verify and keep an overview of everything that's been utilized and why, and the date, and who was the person internally asking for it, and then keeping scanned copies of all the documents of where the chops were. It is an administrative process, okay? And it is a way for you to maintain transparency and clarity over what is being signed, what is being chopped, okay? Now, eventually, these licenses and chops should be kept in your office, maintained by your staff or by an individual within your company. But again, trust is developed over time. You need to earn that trust. And I do have a story where a US company wanted to close down their operation in China. They did a very poor handling of the termination of the GM, who in retaliation kept the whole company kit and licenses and shops, did not return them. And as a consequence, the company couldn't get liquidated. It couldn't even start the process without those licenses and shops. Didn't even have access to the bank account, nothing. Lawyers had to get involved. Lawsuit had to occur, okay? Drama, we don't want drama. So we want to build up this flexibility within the office over time. And be careful knowing who has what and when. And the next, bank account transfers. Who is operating the account in China? Okay, are there going to be multiple people? Will a key token be kept in the HQ? Will a key token be kept in China? Will there be 2 key tokens kept in China? Who is approving transfers? Are there going to be limitations For example, the GM in China cannot, without approval, written approval, do a transfer of over 100,000 RMB. I don't know. This is all made up. You guys have to think about it internally, right? Who is going to operate the bank accounts? What level of transparency are you going to have? Now, I just want to highlight at Woodburn what we do for our clients, just again for you as an idea to think about transparency, clarity, operational guidelines, is every Friday we send out to our clients a logbook update on how chops or licenses have been used for that week. With some clients, we have even a shared file so that they have access to all the documents that have been chopped in that week. In terms of bank account transfers, if you use a corporate service provider, accounting firm, to act as a cashier on your bank account, they will have access to updates on your bank balance. For us, if we have that access every Friday, we give incoming payments, outgoing payments, bank balance information to our clients again every Friday for transparency purposes. All right. Now, naturally, at the end of each month, we give the full log of documents, but this just gives you an idea. Instead of waiting so long, it gives you on a weekly basis an update how these things are being utilized. Setting up limitations and boundaries on who can sign off on contracts. Who's signing off on employment agreements? Who's signing off on third-party providers, sales agreements, purchasing agreements? Who's reading those agreements? Are those agreements translated? Who's managing the whole contract department, which is a necessity for audits and for bank transfers and for a whole bunch of things. So you have to be organized with this. To sign a contract, you need to have your company CHOP. Who's going to have access to that company CHOP to be able to get these documents signed off on? The next is signing termination notices. Now, everybody who's been appointed in the corporate management structure that I highlighted today, or anybody who's a senior manager, you may want them to sign undated termination notices so that these individuals can be removed easily. We had the case with an Italian client who had a huge falling out with their general manager, who was also the legal representative, but was not a board member, not an executive director. They were appointed as legal rep and GM, residing in China. They had a major falling out with them. And because for them, he was in their mind just actually a general manager, they had forgotten he was actually the legal rep. And upon termination, they did not realize that as a corporate service provider, in order to terminate the legal rep's role, we need to provide the replacement, but we also need to provide the signed termination notice. And he refused to sign anything because that's how bad the termination went. He was like, why should I do you a favor, basically? So signing undated termination notices is just a preemptive action that can be kept by a law firm, right? Doesn't have to be kept by the company, does not have to be kept by the individual, but it can be kept by a law firm, whereby you then have the ability upon terminating certain people to be able to remove them from the corporate management structure. And points 6 and 7 are so vital. I can't emphasize how vital. Creating standard operating procedures and guidelines, or creating management directives that are outside of the Articles of Association, that every appointed corporate manager appointed in the corporate structure or any senior manager should sign off on, having said that they've read and understood these directives, these guidelines, these procedures. Most importantly, they should also be read by HQ and the various people involved in that they all remember what the procedures, guidelines, and directives are. Okay, so setting up limitations and boundaries is fundamental. And I know that all of these steps are last things thought about once the company is incorporated. They're so administrative that people leave this as a non-priority item. This is high priority, again, to mitigate risk, and should be thought about prior to the incorporation of the company, ideally. Now, what I also want to highlight is that a lot of people have a fear. Like I said, I started off today's presentation saying people have a certain level of fear as individuals holding on to these roles. So how can you protect your senior managers, but simultaneously protect your company? And again, a lot of people don't think about getting insurance. In China, you can have a director's and officer's liability insurance. It is not a compulsory insurance. It is usually requested by the shareholder, should be requested by the shareholder. It's an insurance that I think is vital for anybody in China. Basically, it protects the company and the Chinese investment from any wrongful act of the management. Simultaneously, it protects the individuals and the candidates from having to pay anything out should they be individually liable for something. For example, the legal representative. I went through the liabilities of the legal rep because that is the most severe. If they are found to be criminally framed, and actually they haven't done anything, they did things without, or they proved things without knowing, or they, this can happen, at least the insurance will cover their legal fees. It will cover everything related to that role. Okay. Now, in addition to all of this, the directors and officers liability insurance is also for if you have been sued over breach of wrongful termination, security fraud, failure to comply with certain laws, regulations, cyber liability, customer liability. I mean, all of this stuff is covered. Of course, you have other types of insurances that will go more in depth into, for example, product liability, employee insurances, etc. There are other ones, but this should be on top of the list in terms of insurances. It's something that will help the company. It is something that will help the individuals who are appointed and hopefully eliminate that fear. Okay. That is basically the end of today's presentation. Now, obviously, in today's presentation, I focused predominantly on the senior managers that are appointed within the corporate management structure. Of course, there may be senior managers that are appointed that are not in the corporate management structure, like an in-house finance manager, finance director, in-house sales manager, purchasing manager, supply chain manager. These are all senior managers that are ultimately helping the GM to make decisions. They are part of this. The issue with them, though, is that their names are not within the government systems as part of the structure of the company. Okay. That's why for me, they're a little bit of a lower level compared to those that are in the corporate management structure. But it pertains to them as well. What are their limitations? What are their boundaries? Do they have guidelines for their departments to help them know what they can and cannot do? So I would love to hear your feedback, as I always do after these presentations. But if you are struggling to appoint individuals within your corporate management or senior management structures, let me know. We can set up a 15-minute pain point discovery call, and I can go through certain techniques to help you overcome these obstacles that you're finding in terms of appointing people. We have had many companies recently have the green light to push their China project, but then individuals have been blocking that green light by saying, oh, actually, I've changed my mind. I don't want to hold those rules. So what we can also do is organize roundtables purely for the company, purely for those individuals, so they have a better understanding of what their roles, responsibilities, liabilities are within the organization, and we can tailor-make that for you. It might help to prevent these roadblocks from happening. When I send out the recording link, I will send out also the link to set up a discovery call and make an appointment with us. If you enjoyed this and you think other people within your organization will enjoy it as well, then please do send them the link to subscribe. The more, the merrier. And last but not least, we don't have a webinar session next Wednesday. I'm on child duty, and I know it'll be havoc when the kids are at home, so we don't have a roundtable next week. But on the 24th of May, we've got a roundtable talking about how corporate banking has changed in 2023. There have been a few changes. Some people may have experienced this already. We certainly have, as well as our clients. And so we wanted to update you on what that looks like. We also wanted to update you on how important it is to find the right bank for you, understanding what they can and cannot do, and going through an interview process with them to see ultimately what's the best course of action. So we've created also an agenda plan for next week for that roundtable, so you have a guideline of how to interview them, what information you should be gathering, and also just how operationally it works when working with the banks. So if you've already registered, you've already got the link, just show up on the 24th of May with the same link. Otherwise, sign up for our events, and thank you. No questions have popped in, but if there are any questions, let me know, and I will leave you at that. It was a shorter session today than the previous 2 or 3, but I hope to see you again all very soon. Have a great day, take care, and goodbye.